I'm 72 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds strange, as if age doesn't suit me, as if time had passed too quickly while I was busy living the life they expected of me. For a long time, I believed that all that was normal. That constant tiredness was part of love. That silence was a sign of maturity. Today, looking back, I realize how much these ideas shaped every choice I made, or didn't make. For almost my entire life, I did exactly what I was told. Not because someone yelled at me, but because I was taught that questioning was wrong. That good people don't complain. That those who love endure. I grew up hearing that I was strong, responsible, reliable. These words sounded like compliments, but over time, they became invisible chains that kept me tied to a role I never consciously chose. When I was younger, I believed that living for others was a virtue. I saw it as a sign of character, almost like a mission. Each time I let go of a desire, I told myself that I was doing the right thing. That my turn would come. I repeated this so many times that I started to believe it. After all, everyone seemed to agree that I was on the right path. The problem is that no one ever asked me what I wanted. The important decisions just happened, and I adapted. I've always been good at adapting. Swallow desires, adjust expectations, move on without making noise. I became convinced that feeling discomfort was selfish, and that thinking of myself was a sign of weakness. Today, sitting in this silent house, I realize how silence has always been present. Before, it was disguised by the noise of voices, hurried footsteps, and daily responsibilities. Now, he is absolute. There aren't enough distractions to drown out the questions I've avoided for decades. Simple but painful questions, such as, at what point did my life cease to be mine? For a long time, I confused obligation with love. I thought caring, sustaining, and protecting was all that mattered. I never stopped to think about the cost of this. I have never calculated the emotional price of always being available, always strong, always ready to solve someone's problem. I just followed, day after day, believing that this was how it was done. People saw me as someone trustworthy. They said I was essential. And maybe I was. But being essential to everyone meant being invisible to myself. My desires became small, almost imperceptible, until they disappeared completely. When I realized, I no longer knew who I would be without the responsibilities I was given. I'm not telling this to seek pity, nor to accuse anyone directly. I'm telling you because, for the first time, I'm being honest with myself. I'm looking at my story without the excuses I used to survive emotionally. And that honesty hurts more than any physical fatigue I've ever felt. There are things that take a lifetime to make sense. Truths that are buried under layers of duty, guilt, and silence. At 72, I finally begin to understand that not everything they called love really was. And this understanding, even late, changes everything. Maybe I can't go back. Maybe time won't give me grandiose second chances. But telling this story is the first time I'm not living just to fulfill a role. It's the first time I've spoken for myself. And that, in itself, is a start. The fact that you've chosen to stay here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What comes next isn't just something personal, it's a silent truth that many people carry and almost never have the courage to face. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel. This is the simplest way to support and keep alive narratives that, deep down, speak to all of us. I was born into a simple family, where things were never easy, but they also never seemed unfair, at least not at first glance. There were no great dramas, no extreme gestures. What existed was a silent, well-defined order, which everyone seemed to understand without having to explain. From a young age, I learned that there were people who decided and people who obeyed. And I was part of the second group. My house was modest, but always clean. My mother did what she could, my father worked a lot and spoke little. Affection was not something shown in words, but in responsibilities. If you helped, you were praised. If he complained, he was corrected with a firm look or a silence that said more than any scolding. Gradually, I understood that pleasing was safer than disagreeing. I was a quiet child. Not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I learned quickly that not all of them should be said. When I did something right, I was told I was right for my age. When I swallowed my tears, they said I was strong. These words accompanied me like invisible medals, but also as clear warnings of who I had to be in order to continue to be accepted. I was never asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. The conversations revolved around what needed to be done, what was needed to keep everything running. Dreams seemed like distant luxuries, reserved for people who had the time and space to make mistakes. I learned that making mistakes was not a safe option for me. At school, I was diligent, but discreet. It didn't attract attention, it didn't create problems. At home, she helped with whatever was needed without question. This made adults trust me. They said I could handle it. And I did. I always did. I just didn't realize that, every time I managed everything, I gave up a little more of myself. There were phrases that were repeated, almost like invisible rules. Don't make drama. This is for the good of the family. You understand, right? I understood. Or I thought I understood. In fact, I just accepted it. Accepting was easier than facing the discomfort of disappointing someone. Over time, I began to feel proud of it. Proud to be trustworthy, to be the one everyone could count on. I felt needed, and that filled a void that I still didn't know how to name. Being necessary seemed to give meaning to my existence. I didn't realize that I was learning to measure my worth only by how much I annulled myself. There were no shouts, no clear impositions. The control came in the form of expectation. If I didn't, someone would be overwhelmed. If I refused, I would be seen as ungrateful. So I did. He always did. And each yes said without thinking strengthened the idea that I didn't have much right to choose. Today, looking back, I see that it was there that it all began. Not in the big event that changed my life, but in these small daily learnings. In those silent lessons that taught me to be quiet, to accept, to follow. It was there that I learned that my voice was not a priority, and I took this lesson with me for decades. At the time, I didn't know. I was just a kid trying to do what felt right. But those foundations shaped everything that came after. And, without realizing it, I was already being prepared to carry responsibilities that were never thought of for me. In my family, there was a phrase that seemed to end any discussion before it even began: family came before everything. It was not said aggressively, but with a weight that did not allow disagreement. Whenever any difficulty arose, someone repeated it, and everyone accepted it as an absolute truth. I also accepted. For a long time, I didn't even think that there could be another way to live. From an early age, I understood that my desires needed to fit into what was best for the group. If something went wrong, the solution was never to ask who was too tired. It was about deciding who was stronger. And, almost always, that someone ended up being me. Not because I asked for that place, but because they put me in it naturally, as if it were obvious. I heard that I could take it longer. That I had a good head. That I understood the situation. These phrases came loaded with a confidence that seemed like praise, but which, deep down, was just a silent transfer of responsibility. Every time they said that, I felt like I couldn't fail. Failing would mean disappointing everyone at the same time. There was no room to say that I was tired too. Tiredness, in that house, was treated as freshness when it came from those who still had strength. And I always had the strength, or at least learned to look like I did. He swallowed the discomfort, took a deep breath, and moved on, convinced that this was what good people did. When I tried to express any doubts, the quick answer came: "We'll see this later." This one never came. The urgencies of others always spoke louder. Gradually, I stopped bringing up my questions. It was simpler to keep everything to myself than to deal with the look of disappointment of those who expected me to always be available. Over time, I began to feel that my role in the family was to keep everything standing. If something fell apart, the blame would surely fall on me. This silent fear kept me alert at all times, as if I was always in debt. A debt that I never remembered having made, but that I felt obliged to pay. I believed that this was unity. That shared weight, even if poorly distributed, was a sign of love. After all, no one was openly forcing me. I only did it because there seemed to be no acceptable alternative. Saying no would mean breaking an invisible pact that everyone respected without question. Today, I see how much this idea of family was used to justify choices that were never mine. Not out of explicit malice, but out of convenience. It was easier to count on me than to share the burden. And I, trained from an early age not to question, accepted this role as destiny. At the time, I didn't call it control. I called it responsibility. He called it maturity. He called it doing the right thing. It wasn't until much later that I understood that doing right by everyone, all the time, can mean doing wrong with yourself. This certainty, that family came before everything else, was the basis that supported the decision that would change my life forever. When the moment came, I was already prepared to accept. Prepared not to choose. Prepared to shut me up once again. I clearly remember the period when everything started to change, although at the time, no one announced this as a definitive turnaround. Things just happened, one after the other, as if it was a natural path I should follow. There was a crisis in the family, one of those that no one wants to face, but which requires quick decisions. And once again, the eyes turned to me. The conversations were always made in a low tone, as if the silence made everything less heavy. There was talk of necessity, of responsibility, of doing the best for the children. No one asked if I was ready. Nobody wanted to know if I wanted to take on that. The question was never, "Do you accept?" but rather, "You understand, don't you?" And I understood. Or he believed that understanding was the only possible answer. I felt a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. A mixture of fear and obligation. Part of me wanted to step back, to say that it wasn't fair, that I also had plans. But this part seemed too small in the face of everything they told me. They said I was the right person. That I was trustworthy. That the children needed someone like me. And, little by little, I became convinced that refusing would be a form of abandonment. There was no clear, signed or declared decision. There was just a sequence of days in which I started to take care of myself more, to solve more, to be more present. When I realized, I was already completely involved. The responsibilities piled up, and no one talked about a deadline anymore. What used to be, until things get better, has simply become the new reality. I remember thinking it would just be a phase that I would handle for a while and then resume my life. This idea helped me move forward. It was easier to believe that I was just putting off my dreams than to accept that I was giving them up. The word temporary was what made everything bearable at that beginning. The children arrived with their own stories, fears, shortcomings. I did what I knew how to do. I took care of it. I prepared meals, organized routines, calmed down tears. The more I dedicated myself, the more the people around me reinforced that I was doing the right thing. This silent recognition hooked me even more to the situation. Inside, however, something was already beginning to break. There were nights when I would lie down exhausted, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my life was being pushed into a smaller and smaller corner. But when I woke up, I pushed those thoughts away. There was no room for doubt when so many people depended on me. Silence has become my companion again. I didn't complain, I didn't confront, I didn't question. I learned to swallow that strange feeling of living something I didn't plan for. I told myself that this was maturity, that I was being strong. I repeated this until it sounded true. As the months passed, it became clear that no one else was looking for alternatives. Everything was already organized around me. I was the fixed point, the ready-made solution. And the more I took on this role, the harder it seemed to imagine a way out that wouldn't hurt someone. That's how everything changed. Not with a conscious choice, but with a silent acceptance. When I realized, my life was no longer following the path I had imagined. And I, once again, kept quiet, believing that this was what was expected of me. In the beginning, everything was accompanied by a phrase that seemed to lighten any weight: it was only for a while. This promise was not made clearly, but it was always implicit in every conversation, in every request. They said that the situation would be resolved, that things would settle down, that I didn't need to worry about the future. It was enough to hold out a little longer. And I, used to believing, accepted. I repeated this to myself in the most difficult moments. When fatigue hit, when the routine seemed too heavy, I reminded myself that none of this would be permanent. He said it was just a phase. That as soon as everything stabilized, I would resume my plans. This idea worked as an emotional anesthetic, reducing the pain of living something I had not chosen. The days began to revolve around their needs. Schedules, commitments, responsibilities. My life was being reorganized without me realizing it. What was once the exception has become the rule. And the more I adapted, the more natural everything seemed in the eyes of others. No one was talking about alternatives anymore. No one else mentioned that it might be temporary. There were times when I thought about asking how long it would last. But there was always something more urgent going on. There was always a justification ready to postpone this conversation. And I, once again, preferred to wait. Waiting seemed less painful than confronting the possibility of being told that there was no deadline at all. As time went by, I began to realize that my own needs were no longer taken into account, not even by myself. I pushed them to a corner, as if saving something fragile for later. I thought I was being responsible, mature, generous. I didn't realize that I was training myself to disappear. People praised my dedication. They said that few would do what I was doing. These comments, although they sounded positive, hooked me even more. How could I complain after being seen as an example? How could you admit that you were tired without seeming ungrateful? So I smiled, nodded, and moved on. There were nights when the silence was heavy again. Lying down, I thought about the life that was being left behind. I thought about the choices that were being postponed indefinitely. But I soon pushed those thoughts away, convinced that it was not time to think about me. Not yet. One day, maybe. The problem is that time has not stopped. The years began to pass without asking permission. What was provisional was consolidated, taking definitive shape. And I realized, with growing discomfort, that no one seemed interested in changing that situation. For everyone, it was already resolved. I still believed that when everything was okay, someone would come to tell me that I could go my way, that I had done enough. But that conversation never happened. And, little by little, I understood that no one was going to release me from that role. I would have to do it myself, something I had never learned. Even so, I continued. I continued because it was easier to stay than to face the unknown. I continued because I still believed that, deep down, all that would make some sense in the future. Today, looking back, I see that this was the phrase that stuck me the most: it was only for a while. A time that ended up becoming a lifetime. As time went by, I realized that silence was not just a consequence of the situation I was living in. It has become a strategy. Keeping quiet seemed to make things easier, avoid conflicts, keep everything running. Whenever a doubt arose within me, I pushed it down, as if hiding something inconvenient. I told myself that talking wouldn't change anything. I learned to measure my words carefully. Before I said anything, I thought about who might feel uncomfortable, worried, or upset. Most of the time, he concluded that it was better not to say anything. That way, I didn't cause any problems. Thus, I continued to be seen as someone who was easy to deal with, someone who understood the situation. There were times when the fatigue was so great that I felt like asking for help. But as I looked around, I saw that everyone seemed to already count on my constant presence. I was part of the gear. If I failed, something would crash. This feeling of being indispensable held me more than any harsh word could hold. When something bothered me deeply, I rationalized. He said that other people were in worse situations. That I was still healthy. That complaining would be ingratitude. This kind of thinking has become automatic. I no longer needed to be silenced by someone outside. I did it myself efficiently. Over time, I lost the habit of listening to myself. My emotions were muffled, distant. I felt, but I didn't name what I felt. It was as if acknowledging my own pain was a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed to be available, functional, whole, even when I didn't feel that way anymore. People praised my calmness. They said that I never changed, that I was balanced. They didn't know that calm was built on the basis of swallowing feelings. They didn't see the constant effort to keep everything under control. To them, I seemed stable. Inside, I just kept silent. There were days when I wondered when was the last time someone had asked how I was really doing. Not as a formality, but with real interest. I couldn't remember. Perhaps this would never have happened. Maybe I would never have given space for this to happen. I got so used to being quiet that talking started to feel awkward. As if my words were excessive, unnecessary. I felt ashamed just to imagine expressing some kind of dissatisfaction. Shame of looking weak. Shame of disappointing. Shame of existing outside the role they gave me. That prolonged silence began to shape me. I no longer knew where the obligation ended and where the fear began. Everything was mixed in a heavy but predictable routine. And predictability, at that moment, seemed safer than any attempt at change. Today, looking back, I see that learning to be quiet was one of the most expensive lessons I received. Not because silence is always wrong, but because it cost me the chance to be heard when there was still time. And, without realizing it, I became more and more distant from myself. Over the years, I realized that my life began to exist always in the background. Everything that concerned me was pushed to later, to when there was time, to when things were calmer. This after became a distant, almost imaginary place, which I visited only in quick thoughts before returning to the routine. I had simple desires. They were not great ambitions, nor extravagant dreams. They were common, human desires. But even these seemed inconvenient in the face of the responsibilities I carried. There was always something more urgent, someone in need more, a situation that required my immediate attention. And so, my wishes were being postponed without a set date. Over time, I even stopped talking about what I wanted. Not because he had forgotten completely, but because it seemed useless to mention. Nobody asked, and I didn't offer either. I learned to answer, "It's okay," automatically, even when I wasn't. This answer made things easier and avoided explanations that I wouldn't know how to give. The routine has become predictable. Wake up, solve, take care, organize. Repeat. The days were mixed, and the years passed faster than I expected. Sometimes, I realized this when I noticed small changes in my body, in my face, in my mood. Time was passing, even if my life seemed to be at a standstill. There were times when I felt a pang of envy at the sight of people going their own ways. Not bitter envy, but silent sadness. I wondered what it would be like if I had made different choices. Soon after, came the guilt for thinking like that. I remembered everything that depended on me and convinced myself that this thought was selfishness. I told myself that, in the end, all that would have been worth it. That the sacrifice would be rewarded in some way. This idea helped me to continue. It was easier to believe in a future direction than to face the emptiness that was beginning to form inside me. As time went by, I moved away from myself. I could no longer say what I liked, what I didn't like. My answers were always tailored to the needs of others. I became good at molding myself, at fitting in wherever I needed to. And, without realizing it, I stopped occupying my own space. The people around me seemed to move on, each building their own story. I stayed there, making sure everything worked. I was the fixed point, the base. But bases don't move. They only sustain. And no one asks the base if it would also like to walk. Sometimes, at night, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. Not for long. Soon he pushed these images away, as if closing a forbidden door. I said it was past time. That certain choices were no longer possible. And this idea, repeated many times, ended up becoming an absolute truth. Today, looking back, I see how my life was suspended, always waiting for a moment that never came. I didn't lose it all at once. I lost little by little, day after day, choice after choice. And when I realized, the after was already behind me. For a long time, I believed that everything I did was love. Love in its purest, quietest, most sacrificial form. That's how I was taught to understand this feeling, as something that requires constant renunciation, that doesn't ask questions and doesn't impose limits. If it hurt, it was because it was worth it. If he got tired, it was because it was true. I confused care with obligation. He thought that always being available was proof of affection. I never stopped to think about whether love should also include respect, choice, and reciprocity. For me, to love was to stay, even when everything inside me asked for rest. It was to remain steadfast, even when I was already exhausted. Whenever someone recognized my effort, it reinforced my belief. They said I had a big heart, that I was rare, that few would do what I did. I received these words as confirmation that I was on the right path. I didn't realize that, at the same time, they prevented me from questioning whether that path was also fair to me. There were times when I felt like leaving, changing everything, starting something of my own. But soon the thought came that this would be abandonment. I used to tell myself that people who love don't give up. That leaving would be a betrayal of everything I had built. And so, I stayed. He always was. I watched other people talking about love with lightness, with joy, with exchange. That seemed distant, almost unreal. My love was heavy, silent, lonely. There was no room for doubt or fragility. It was a love that required resistance, not emotional presence. As time went on, I began to feel that something was wrong, but I didn't know exactly what. I was always tired, always tense, always attentive to the needs of others. Even so, I kept telling myself that it was love. It was easier to sustain this idea than to face the possibility of having experienced something distorted. I believed in the stories they told me. I believed it when they said I was needed. I believed it when they said that no one would do better. I believed it when they said it would all be rewarded. I believed in them more than in myself. Gradually, I realized that I had never been taught to love myself. That seemed selfish. It seemed wrong. Everything that involved taking care of myself was seen as excess, as a whim. So I excluded this possibility from my life, convinced that loving others was enough. Today, looking back, I understand that love should not require the erasure of those who love. It should not silence, control, or arrest. But this understanding only came after many years of living a version of love that consumed me little by little, without making noise. At the time, I had no words for it. I just kept going, believing I was doing the right thing. Believing that it was love. And it was this belief that sustained everything for so long, even when it was already clear that something inside me was being lost. Time passed in a strange way. It wasn't too fast or too slow, just constant, as if each day pushed the next one without warning me of what was happening. The children grew up before me, and I was present at every stage. I helped in the first steps, in the difficulties, in the fears. I did everything in my power to make them feel safe. But as they advanced, something in me seemed to remain still. I remember realizing, little by little, that they no longer needed me in the same way. It was not a sudden break. It was a quiet, almost polite withdrawal. One day, they stopped asking for help with small things. Then they started to solve everything on their own. I watched this with a confused mixture of pride and strangeness, not knowing exactly what to do with that feeling. At first, I convinced myself that this was the natural course of life. Children grow up, follow their paths. I repeated this as a logical explanation, trying to ward off any discomfort. But as the days passed, I began to notice something that made me uneasy. No one seemed to wonder what would happen to me when it was all over. The conversations became shorter. The visits, more spaced out. There were always appointments, work, plans. I understood. I always understood. I spent my whole life understanding. Still, there were times when I kept looking at the clock, waiting for a phone call that didn't come, trying not to admit to myself that I missed it. The house began to change almost imperceptibly. The objects were still in the same places, but the atmosphere was different. The constant noise gave way to a heavy silence, different from the silence I already knew. It was not the silence of those who swallow feelings. It was the silence of those who are no longer needed. And that kind of silence hurts in a deeper way. It was during this period that I began to realize how much my identity was linked to the role I played. I always knew what to do when someone needed me. I have always had a clear function. When this function began to disappear, I felt lost. I didn't know how to occupy the time, nor how to occupy myself. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that now it was my turn to rest. But the rest was accompanied by an emptiness that was difficult to explain. It was not relief. It was a strange feeling of not knowing who I was without that constant care routine. As if, by no longer being necessary, I had also ceased to be seen. I watched from afar the life they were building. New jobs, new relationships, new plans. I was happy for them, really. I never wanted it to be different. But at the same time, there was a quiet pain in realizing that I was no longer part of the center of those stories. I had been instrumental in the beginning, but seemed expendable in the end. There were days when I thought about talking, asking for more closeness, saying that I still needed them in some way. But something inside me said that this would be exaggeration, neediness, weakness. I didn't want to be a burden. I spent my whole life avoiding this. So I kept myself contained, polite, distant, even when loneliness tightened. It was in this prolonged silence that I began to wonder, for the first time, if I had given more than I should have. Not out of love, but out of lack of choice. Not by will, but by conditioning. This question came up timidly, almost like a whisper, and I still didn't have the courage to listen to it completely. They have grown up. They moved on. They built their own lives, as they should. And I stayed. I was left with the memories, the silent house, and the uncomfortable feeling that while I was fully dedicated to them, I ended up letting my own life pass without realizing it. The house was not silent at once. The silence gradually entered, occupying spaces that were previously filled with voices, footsteps, and small confusions of everyday life. At first, I even thought I was going to rest. I thought that sound emptiness was a sign of tranquility. But I soon realized that it was not peace that I felt. It was absence. The rooms remained the same, but they seemed bigger, colder. I walked around the house and had the strange feeling of occupying a place that no longer needed me. Schedules have lost importance. There was no more urgency, no requests, no more people waiting for me to solve something. What had tired me for so many years was now missing in a way that was difficult to explain. I would sit at the table alone and remember when it was never empty. He remembered the hurried meals, the interrupted conversations, the constant worries. All of this had been heavy, but it gave meaning to my days. Now, the silence forced me to face something I had avoided for decades. I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried to fill the time with small tasks. I tidied up things that were already tidy. I cleaned what didn't need cleaning. It was a way to keep myself busy, to pretend that there was still something to be done. But when I stopped, the silence came back stronger, almost like a reminder of all that had changed. There were nights when I turned on the television just so I wouldn't hear my own thoughts. It didn't matter what I was going through. The sound served only as company. I avoided silence because, when it settled completely, it was accompanied by questions that I did not know how to answer. Questions about choices, about time, about everything that was left behind. I began to realize that silence also brought memories. Memories that I had pushed away for too long. Moments when I wanted something different. Thoughts that I considered inappropriate. All that reappeared now, unhurriedly, as if she knew I had nowhere else to run. I wondered if this was how old age should be. Not the tiredness of the body, but this emptying inside. The feeling of having fulfilled everything that was expected of me and, even so, feeling that something essential was missing. Something that could no longer be recovered with effort or goodwill. On some days, I felt a silent sadness, hard to name. It was not anger, nor revolt. It was a gentle, constant pain, which settled without making noise. I looked around and saw a lifetime dedicated to others, but little that really represented me. It was in this prolonged silence that I began to understand that I had always been reacting to the needs of others. When these needs disappeared, it became evident how much I had neglected myself. Not out of malice, but out of habit. A habit built over many years. The silent house became a mirror. In every empty corner, I saw parts of myself that never had room to exist. And for the first time, I began to suspect that this story of love, duty, and sacrifice might have cost more than I was willing to admit. The silence, which I had once feared, began to teach me difficult things. He wouldn't let me hide anymore. And even though it was painful, I felt that something inside me was beginning to wake up, still confused, still fragile, but finally aware of what had been lost. It was not a big event. There was no shouting, no arguments, no dramatic revelation. It was something small, almost banal, that happened on an ordinary day. Precisely for this reason, it took me a few moments to realize that something had changed inside me. But when I realized, there was no way to ignore it. It all started with a quick conversation, one of those made without thinking too much. A phrase said without intention to hurt, but that fell on me like an old weight. It was not something new. I had heard similar words before. The difference is that, on that day, they did not pass straight through. They stayed. After the conversation was over, I sat for a while, in silence. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, as if something was trying to surface after years of being buried. It wasn't anger. It was also not common sadness. It was a feeling of painful recognition, as if I was finally seeing something that had always been there. I began to mentally review many moments of my life. Small situations that, isolated, seemed normal. Requests made as if they were soft orders. Expectations placed on me without any consultation. The way my needs were always left for later. All of this began to connect in a way that had never happened before. It was at that moment that an idea began to form, still shy, but insistent. Maybe I had never had a real choice. Maybe I had just been led, step by step, to accept a life that wasn't exactly what I wanted. This realization scared me more than anything else. I felt a mixture of relief and pain. Relief to finally understand that not everything was my fault. Pain for realizing how much it cost. I always carried a silent guilt for feeling tired, for wishing for something different. At that moment, that guilt began to crack. I realized that I spent my whole life trying to correspond, trying to be enough, correct, strong. I never stopped to ask if all that was also doing me good. I never considered that I could have been treated unfairly without it having to be explicit or violent. The idea that I had been silenced in such a subtle way began to gain ground. No one had to forbid me from anything. It was enough to convince me that my wishes were less important. And I believed it. I believed for so long that this version of reality became absolute truth. That day, I felt something break. It was not a noisy break. It was like an internal fissure, silent, but irreversible. From then on, I could no longer pretend that everything had been just the result of conscious and free choices. I spent the rest of the day different, quieter than usual, but in a new way. It was not the silence of those who swallow. It was the silence of those who begin to understand. For the first time, I allowed the question to arise without pushing it away. What if I hadn't been to blame? This question did not bring immediate answers. But it brought something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. A painful, belated, but necessary clarity. Something inside me had woken up. And I knew that, after that day, it would no longer be possible to go back to sleep the same way. This is the hardest part to tell, the one I've spent my whole life avoiding saying out loud. To talk about it now means to give up the last protection I had, the silence that allowed me to survive. If you've made it this far, it's because you understand the weight of these truths and the cost of keeping them hidden. So I ask you to sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that voices like this don't disappear when they finally find the courage to speak out. After that day, something inside me changed quietly but definitively. There was no sudden transformation, nor a sense of immediate release. What happened was the beginning of a slow, almost cautious process of questioning. For the first time, I allowed guilt to be observed from the outside, as something that might not belong to me completely. I always carried guilt as if it were part of my personality. Guilt for thinking about myself, guilt for getting tired, guilt for wishing for something different. She was present in everything, shaping my decisions, regulating my feelings. Questioning her seemed dangerous, almost wrong. But after that internal fissure, I could no longer accept it without thinking. I began to revisit my story with different eyes. Situations that I had previously justified automatically began to look different. I realized how many decisions were made by me without me really having room to choose. How I was led to believe that refusing would be hurting, and that accepting was the only way to be worthy. This realization did not come without pain. On the contrary. In many moments, I felt a deep sadness when I recognized how much I had annulled myself. It was not anger at others, but a kind of mourning for myself. A belated mourning for everything I didn't live, for everything I silenced to maintain harmony. At the same time, something curious began to happen. As the guilt lost strength, I felt a small relief. As if an old weight was being taken away, inch by inch. I still didn't know what to do with this new sensation, but it showed me that maybe I wasn't as wrong as I always thought. I began to observe my reactions more closely. When that automatic impulse to blame myself arose, I tried to stop and question. Where does this come from? Why do I feel responsible for everything? These questions had no immediate answers, but they were already a breakthrough. For many years, I didn't even allow myself to do them. I also realized how much I was conditioned to believe that my limits didn't matter. That I should always give a little more, endure a little more. Recognizing this was uncomfortable, but necessary. It wasn't easy to admit that I had accepted so much without realizing the impact it had on me. There were times when the old guilt tried to come back with force. In which I thought I was exaggerating, that I was being unfair to the past. At those times, I took a deep breath and remembered the accumulated fatigue, the prolonged silence, the loneliness that remained. These signs have always been there. I just learned to ignore them. Gradually, I understood that responsibility should not mean erasure. That caring for others does not require abandoning oneself. This idea was still new to me, almost strange. But at the same time, it made deep sense, like something I should have learned much earlier. The guilt began to fall, not all at once, but in small parts. Each time I recognized that I did the best I could within the conditions I had, something softened inside me. I wasn't weak because I got tired. He was not selfish because he wanted another life. I was human. This understanding did not solve everything. It did not erase the past or bring time back. But it gave me something I never had, permission to look at myself with more compassion. And at that point, this was already a huge change. After the guilt began to fall, I imagined for a moment that maybe a confrontation would come. I thought I would feel like saying everything that was kept, to demand explanations, to demand some kind of recognition. But that never happened. Not because I had nothing to say, but because, when I was finally able to look at everything clearly, I realized that there was no more energy for it. I understood that no one would admit what happened. Not out of conscious malice, but because each one built their own version of history. For them, everything was done in the best possible way. And, within this narrative, my silence has always been interpreted as agreement. Questioning now would be like speaking a language that no one else understands. There were times when I rehearsed conversations in my head, phrases that would explain how I felt, how I got lost, how I erased myself. But as I imagined the other side's reaction, I realized that it would probably end in justification, discomfort, or denial. And I was tired of explaining what they never wanted to hear. There were no fights. There were no charges. There was only a silent realization that this recognition would not come. And, strangely, accepting that brought a kind of peace. A sad peace, it is true, but real. I no longer had to fight for something that might never have really existed. I started to observe the people around me with more emotional distance. Not with coldness, but with lucidity. I saw how each one went on with their lives believing that everything was solved. And for the first time, I understood that I no longer needed to sustain this structure alone. Accepting without confronting did not mean agreeing. It meant choosing not to carry a weight that no longer belonged to me. For many years, I adapted to avoid conflict. Now, I chose silence for another reason, to preserve what little emotional energy I had left. I also realized that I didn't need their validation to recognize my own history. What I experienced was real, even if no one else wants to name it that way. The pain existed, the fatigue existed, the erasure existed. And that was enough as truth. Not confronting was, in a way, my last act of autonomy. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to other people's expectations. I was choosing what was possible for me at that moment. And this choice, even silent, was significant. There was a discrete mourning in this process. The mourning for the idealized family, for the recognition that never came, for the conversation that never happened. I allowed myself to feel it without blaming myself, without trying to solve it. Just feel and accept. I understood that some stories don't have a perfect closure. Some just go as far as they can go. And, in my case, reaching this understanding was already a huge advance. I didn't need confrontation anymore to move forward. In the end, there was no external confrontation. But there was something much more important, an encounter with myself, albeit a late one. And, for the first time, this was enough. After all that I understood, came a question that I avoided for a long time: who am I now? Without the role I played for so many years, without the responsibilities that defined my days, without the constant obligation to be available. This question did not come loaded with despair, but with a deep strangeness, as if I were meeting someone for the first time. I started to observe my routine with different eyes. The habits I had maintained for years no longer made as much sense. Waking up early unnecessarily, organizing things that no one else needed, maintaining an order that no longer served anyone but me. I realized that many of these actions were just remnants of a life that had already changed, but that I had not yet learned to update. At first, it scared me. The absence of a clear role made me insecure. I always knew exactly what was expected of me. Now, no one expected anything. And this unexpected freedom was accompanied by a void that was difficult to name. It was not pure sadness, nor complete relief. It was an open space, with no instructions. I began to notice small details about myself that had never received attention. Simple things, like what I liked to listen to read, to do when there was no rush. I discovered timid, almost embarrassed preferences, as if they weren't sure they could exist. It was strange to realize that I still had desires, even after so many years without listening to them. I also faced the weight of regret. Not that regret that paralyzes, but a quieter, more reflective one. I thought about who I could have been, about the possibilities that fell by the wayside. These ideas were accompanied by a gentle sadness, which I learned to accept without trying to push it away immediately. At the same time, I began to feel something new, a slight compassion for myself. For the first time, I could look at my history without blaming myself all the time. I saw the young man I was, trying to do the right thing with the tools I had. And instead of judging him, I felt like welcoming him. What was left of me was not grandiose. It was not an idealized version, nor a story of complete overcoming. He was someone tired, but lucid. Someone who lost a lot, but who finally understood why. This understanding did not give back time, but gave meaning to what remained. I began to accept that my life no longer needed to follow other people's expectations. Even if there was little time left, it was still mine. This idea, simple and belated, began to change the way I looked at my days. Not with exaggerated enthusiasm, but with a different, more honest calm. I learned that rebuilding doesn't mean starting from scratch. Sometimes, it just means reorganizing what is left, with more respect and less demand. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, nor be strong all the time, nor carry guilt that did not belong to me. What was left of me was enough to continue. Maybe not for big changes, but for small conscious choices. Small gestures of care for myself. And for someone who has spent his whole life putting himself in last place, this was already something immense. I still didn't know exactly what I would do from then on. But for the first time, this uncertainty did not seem to me to be a threat. It seemed just part of life. A part that, finally, I was willing to live for myself. I have reached this point in my life without great external revelations, without applause and without reparations. What has changed has happened inside, silently, almost discreetly. There was no moment when everything made sense at once. What happened was an accumulation of small understandings that, together, brought me here. I spent a long time believing that my story was already closed, that everything that mattered was behind me. Today, I see that this is not completely true. Maybe I can't rewrite the past, but I can still look at it honestly. And this honesty, even late, has a value that I underestimated for years. I learned that prolonged silence also leaves marks. That living in silence does not erase pain, it only postpones it. I carried a lot believing that it was an obligation, when, in fact, it was fear of disappointing, fear of being seen as insufficient, fear of choosing myself. If I could say something to anyone listening to this story, I would say pay attention to the little signs. To the fatigue that does not go away. To the constant feeling of being trapped. To the guilt that arises whenever you think of yourself. These things don't appear out of nowhere. They are warnings that something needs to be looked at more carefully. I know that it is not always possible to change everything. I know that we are often stuck in real, difficult, complex circumstances. But I also know that living without ever listening to yourself has a high cost. A cost that is only revealed when time has passed too much to ignore. Today, I don't seek compensation. I don't expect anyone to go back or recognize what they didn't want to see. What I am looking for now is something simpler, to live what is still possible with more truth. Make small, conscious choices. Respect my boundaries, even if no one else is looking. Maybe I didn't live the life I envisioned when I was young. Perhaps many doors closed without me even trying to open them. But understanding this allows me to at least stop pretending that everything was exactly as it should be. And stopping pretending is liberating. I don't tell this story to cause sadness. I tell you because I know that many people live something similar in silence. People who learned early to obey, to give in, to erase themselves. People who believed that this was love, when in fact it was just emotional survival. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told. And when they finally come to the surface, they don't change everything, but they change enough. They change the way we see ourselves. They change the weight we carry. They change the way we move forward. Even late, it still matters. It is important to recognize. It is important to name. It is important to treat yourself with more kindness. The time that has passed does not come back, but the time that remains can still be lived in a more honest way. This was my story. Not perfect, not heroic, just real. And, for the first time, I can say that it also belongs to me. If something from this story touched you, share this video. Not only as content, but as a way to take this message to those who live in silence and have not yet been able to name what they feel. There are patterns that only begin to change when someone decides to pass this story on. Sharing it can be just that gesture. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. From what city or country are you watching, and what about this story has echoed in you? Your words are not lost, they really reach me.